Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs and my name is Deepak. In the previous tutorial, we have spoken about selectors, we have also spoken about reducer and component. We have also created a few components. We have also seen how store works, right? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about the action and effects and services and how they function, right? So this is a very important lecture and also going to be a little lengthy one. So please stay tuned. Let me help you understand what action, effects, services, and reducer are. All right. So let me start by drawing this. Okay, so you may have noticed, and we have also discussed this in the past briefly, that if a component needs to update a store, the updation process goes this way. So first of all, the component basically triggers an action. So this is a first step, right? And then this action is basically intercepted by effects. So this is a second step. And once the effects intercepts it, it makes a call to the service, like the arrow, as you can see, moving out from effects to service. So this is a third step. And once a service call is made, service receives the data and sends it back to effects, or basically effects receives the data from the service, and this data, which can be termed as step 4, is again sent back to reducer through an action. So as you can see, there is an arrow which is moving out from effects, which is basically representing an action that is triggered in order to update a store. And once an effect triggers an action, this particular action is then intercepted by reducer, and reducer is then, so this I can term it as step number 5, and this reducer then intercepts this particular action and updates the store, like the way you can see over here, the arrow which is moving out from reducer. So this is going to be step number 6. So these are the 6 steps I'm going to be talking about. So let me recap. The first step is basically from the component an action is triggered, and this action is then intercepted by the effect, which is the second step, and then this effects makes call to service, which is a third step, and then from service it receives the data in the effect, which is a step number 4, and then effects triggers another action, which is step number 5, and this action is then intercepted by reducer, and then reducer updates the store, which is a step number 6. So these are the 6 steps I'm going to be talking about in detail, and also going to be explaining you one by one. So let me clear out the board once again, and I'll start from the scratch, right? So now let me start by creating an action. So this is going to be the step number 1. So let me take you to the code editor, and then we'll start writing that, right? So here is the code editor. Let me close down everything, and as you can see that there is nothing available in my GitHub to commit. All the data, which all the records and files which I've written earlier are being committed, right? So now let me come here, close this down as well. So the first step is going to be the writing of an action for triggering an effect, which should be intercepted by effects, right? So I'm going to be basically opening the state, and inside the state I'm going to be writing a particular file which will house all the, and inside the state I'm going to be creating a file with the name called actions. So it's going to be a student record action, and this action is and the action definition would be defined inside this file. So right, so let me write down this particular file. So it's going to be student record action. Let me save this. Okay, I think I've copied it in a different place. Let me put this here. Move. Okay, this is an empty file at this moment, and I'm going to be basically writing an action. So in order to write an action, first of all, we'll have to import some of the methods from the NgRx store. So the first line I'm going to be writing is import line from @NgRx/store, and I'm going to be importing 2 methods in here. Create action. The second one is props, right? So after this is done, I'm going to be coming to the line number 3, and here I'm going to be defining the list of actions required, I'm going to be writing the action. So let me define those. And this is going to be type object. Inside that, I'm going to be writing the first action, which is called student records API. This is going to be the first action. And this action, I'm going to be so consider a scenario where you have a large application. So all these actions are nothing but small activities that you want your state to perform or you want your application to perform. So there is a nomenclature or there is a good best practice in term. There's a best practice available for writing an action. So the best practice says the first thing that you write inside an action text has to be the name of the component from which this action would be triggered. Right, so now let me take you back to the browser, and if you go back to browser, you can see that the component is a place where I'm going to be initiating this action. So what is the name of the component where I'm going to be triggering this action? So let me take you back to the code editor, and we realize that the name of the record, or no, the name of the component is going to be students table, right? So I'm going to be writing an action in which the first few text between the bracket would represent what is the name of the component. In our case, it's going to be student table. So and in case if you really want to write it all together, you can always write, but I have defined spaces as well in the middle, and this is a best practice that I usually follow. Please understand that these small practices actually are very useful when you're writing a large application, because over time, when you have written thousands of lines of code, and if you have not really followed best practices, it gets really difficult for you to change anything or to manage that code. So it is always a best practice to start these from the step one, from the get-go. You ensure that you write right amount of code, you write right piece of code, and which is basically adhering to the standards, right? So the first action I'm going to be writing, which should be intercepted by the effects, is going to be the call the students record API, right? So let me write it down this way: call, right? Call students record API. The other action I'm going to be writing is basically when this record to API is successful, right? So once it is successful, I'm going to be basically initiating another action which has to be intercepted by the reducer. So the name of that action is going to be students record API success, right? And yeah, let me save this down. So these are the texts that I'm going to be using in the other two action. So how do you create an action? It's fairly simple. You write it down like this: call API, create action, record, and like this. Now you can see that I have mapped these actions like this. So create action is a method in which the first argument of it is a long string, the string which represent the action, and that the string must, as I said earlier, string must have the name of the component from which it triggers, and also the task that it is supposed to execute. So in our case, it's going to be triggering from the students table component, and the task that it does is the call student record API. And once the API is successful, then the second action would be triggered, which is basically a students table component, again the name of the component, and call student record API success, which would basically update the store, right? So let me save this all, and then here, if you notice, so the first action is going to be from the create action. So as you can see that the create action has two possible parameters, but then the second one is not mandatory. So the first one represents the action, which has to be a string like the way we have defined in the line number 4. So create action is basically creating an action, and this action is stored in a constant which is called call student record records API. And then the second action is called student record API success, right? Again, it's part of the create action. The second argument in the create action method represents what is the data that you really wish to. Let's say in case if you want to update the store with your with the data, and this is how you would define. You will have to define the property with the name props, and inside that you will have to define what type of property it's going to be. So in our case, it's going to be, let me define this as well, payload, and this payload is going to be of type student record. So we'll have to import that type which we have defined in the previous episodes. It's going to be here students records, and here let me save this, put this here, and save this again, and it's going to be of type array. Yep. So now you can see that we have defined the action, and now we are going to be defining the effects and service. But before that, let me again take you back to the browser and tell you that what we have seriously achieved. So the first part of this thing is done already. So we have defined this particular action, and this action has to be basically intercepted by the effect, which is over here, right? So I'm going to be writing the step number 2. So how do we write that? So let me again take you back to the VS Code. Here in the VS Code, we can close this down, and please understand that any asynchronous action or any side effect to your application is basically done through effects. So effects are something which is part of the Redux design, and then now we are going to be writing one effect, the effect in which we will intercept the action, the first action, which is basically the call student record API action, and that particular action will be intercepted by the effect, and that's when it will do a call to the service in order to receive the data from the internet, right? So let me close this down here, and I'm going to be writing the another file which is going to be the students records effects.ts. So here I'm going to be basically writing the effect. So please note that I am saving the extension as actions, effects, records, selector, reducer, and so on and so forth, right? So please try to follow the similar naming convention. It's going to be helping you in the long run, right? So in order to write the effect, first of all, I'll have to import a certain library and certain methods from different libraries which are installed. So let me put them down here like this. And now I'm going to be basically importing the action list, the list which we have defined just previously. So this is from the student record action, and we go here. I think I've given a name incorrectly. It has to be actions list, right? Then let me correct this here as well. All right, so now we have imported all of this, and also notice that there is a separate effect that we need to install in order to use it. As you can see, the red squiggly line below NgRx effect. So let me do that as well. Right, so npm I @ NgRx / effects. It'll take a moment and install this, and then the red squiggly would be gone. Looks like some error. Okay, so it looks like I'll have to make a correct arrangement in order to run this. So let me run it with the legacy pdabs flag. I'll take a moment to install this here. And now we can see that the effects are installed, and then that's how the squigglies, the red color underline has gone. Okay, so let me reduce this height of this particular bit, save this file once again. And these effects are basically written in an injectable manner, in which, so what it essentially means is that these are going to be injected at the injector tree. So let me define it like this. Export, first of all, define the injectable, and then I'm going to be defining the effects like this. Press enter. Create effect. This particular method accepts a callback method, and this method is what which we are going to be defining now. This directions $pipe, and I'll have to define the constructor. And inside the constructor, I'm going to be basically pulling in the actions. And I'm also need to define the students record service. I believe that the service is not written just yet because this service is going to be having an HTTP code. I'll be used to fetch the records saved on the internet, which I'll come to a little while later. And then just let me write down the code which is required for it. All right, I'll come to this part and correct the error, but before that, let me write down the service as well. So service code, I'm basically going to be writing inside a services folder. So let me close this down as well, and let me create another folder with a name called services. And inside services, I'm going to be creating a file. And this file is going to be hosting the service code level code, right? So service we have written in the past as well in different tutorials. So let me import all of these. Write down injectable, and inside the injectable, I'm going to be making this as a global service. So provided in has to be root. And after this, I'm going to be exporting student service like this. Then let me write down get students records. All right, so we have written a service, and the service is being called here. Let me write down the import statement as well. We have imported the service. We've also done this bit, and we are going to be writing the code. But let me write down this one. This .http .get and this is going to be of type students records, and it's also going to be of type array. Let me define it this way. All right, so now we have written a code pretty much. Let me correct the indentation like this. So in this particular method, what's really happening is that it returns another action, the action which should be intercepted by the reducer, and that reducer would basically make use of this particular student record. And this student record is going to be holding all the data which has to be stored in the state, right? So this is pretty much done, and I think I'll have to take you back to the browser and show you what is that we are going to be doing once again, right? All right, so now you had seen from the component, the first step was to basically write an action, and this particular action has to be intercepted by the effects, right? So how it is intercepted by the effect, let me again take you back to the code editor. And here at the code editor, if you look at the line number 12, right, what it really does is that it is first of all an injectable class, which means that it is going to be dynamically injected inside the app. And here, if you look at line number 12, it says of type action list call student record API. So this is the action which has to be triggered by the component, and this particular action will be intercepted by this student records effects. And once it is intercepted, it is basically going to be making a call to the student record service get student records API method, which will basically bring in all the result, and that particular result, which should be stored at student's record, will be again sent back to the reducer through an action, right? So the line number 12 is basically the second step of the diagram that we had been discussing earlier. So let me again go take you back to the browser, right? So you see that the line number 12 was basically this, and then it makes a call to the service, which is here, right? So this was the third step, and this third step was basically represented by line number 13. Or again, let me take you back to the code editor. Now you can see that line number 13 is basically making a call to the student record service, get student records, right? So once you receive the data, that's when you will have to again update the effect, and this particular effect will be then triggering an action at line number 15. Now again, let me take you back to the code editor, take you back to the browser. So here the third step was done in the service level, and you receive the data, and then you trigger another action over here, right, which is a step number 5. So bringing back the result was step number 4. The 4 you had seen in the previous code snippet was basically at line number 13 and 14, which 14, right? So once you receive the response, the student records, that's when you initiate another action, which was done basically at line number 15. So we had seen previously. So line number 15, which when it triggers another action, which is basically call student records API success, that'll be intercepted by reducer, and that's when it'll update the store, right? So this is going to be the step number 6. It'll be a little daunting for you to make sense initially what I'm talking about, but once you get a hang of what NgRx is and what Redux is, it's going to be very simple for you to understand, right? But you just have to follow along and trust me that what I'm telling you is absolutely right, and I'm following all the standards which is required to basically write an effect, action, selector, and so on and so forth, right? So we are done till the step 5, which is here. Now I'm basically going to be writing the service and the data fetching part, the database, which is not available just yet. So I'm going to be writing this particular bit of logic, and then we'll show you how it functions. So let me again take you back to the code editor. So I'm going to be closing all these open files down, and I want to bring your attention to something important, right? So let me take you back to the browser, and here at the browser, there is a very important and a famous package called json-server. Right, so let me open json-server. Right, so here at the json-server, this is a very important package that I often use along with many other applications. This is where we can mock the application API which are required for our application, and then the mocking becomes a lot easier, and then using this you can basically create a lot of scenarios. In our case, we are going to be focusing a lot on the UI side of things alone. We are not going to be basically focusing on raw going to be writing the backend code per se. So that's why it is very important for us to get a hang of this. And I would request all of you guys to at least scan through this particular page, and you would get a lot of ideas as how you can basically use json-server in various different scenarios for your unit testing or for your development as well. So now this is what I'm going to be using. I already have this installed in my system, and I already have this installed and included in the application that I'm building. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be basically using this. I'm basically going to be using this to render or to mimic the APIs, right? So let me take you back to code editor, and here at the code editor, what I'm going to do is basically creating, I'll first of all try to create a file called db.json, right? So let me write it down this way. So db.json, I already have the content for db.json available in a different file in my system. So I'm going to be copy pasting this particular bit from that file to here, and I'll explain you what exactly it's going to be doing, right? So here's the content of the db.json, and if you go further to the top of the page, you would realize that there are essentially going to be two APIs here. So the first one is the login API, the other one is the students record API. So student record API is the API that we are concerned about at this moment. So it's going to be having the result, student record result in the same array format, as you can see, which starts at line number 6, and it's going to be having a few records, and that's which I would render when I run the JSON server, right? So in order to run the JSON server, it's fairly simple. You just have to write down, and if you don't have JSON server installed, I would request you to install one. So npm i JSON server is the command. It'll take a moment and update the JSON server, and I already have one. So now let me start the API. So it's as simple as this: JSON server db.json, the file which you have recently built, right? So the moment you press enter, it will tell you how many other APIs we have. So first is the login, the second is the students record. There's another thing to note over here is that I'm not basically going to be, as you may notice, that the JSON server is running at port number 3000, and the application that we have built is running on 4200. So these are two different ports, and if you really need to make two different ports communicate, you really need to take care of the course related stuff, right? So and when you're writing an application, when you're writing the JSON, when you're writing an Angular or any other application in the UI, you particularly in Angular, there is a conf file available in which using which you can basically make two different ports communicate or two different domains communicate with one another without having to see the course related arrow. Right? So CORS, which is called as cross origin resource sharing. So why cross origin? Because although it is localhost but running a different port, which is one is on 4200, the other one is on 3000. So in order to run this, I'm going to be creating a proxy file. So the proxy file name is going to be proxy.conf.json. So let me just write down this here. I'm going to be creating another file called proxy.json, and this is the name of the file. If you notice, what it really does at line number 2 is that it intercepts all the requests which are coming at our /API path. So any request that comes at /API path, it's going to be putting that in this particular domain, which is localhost 3000, and that localhost 3000 is the 3000 port where we are running our JSON server and APIs are being rendered. All right, so now we have created the proxy conf file where we have also running the JSON server at port number 3000. So I'm going to be putting this here at the package JSON. And if you go further at the top of the package JSON, you would realize that I've given a command called ngserve. And here at the command, I will have to write down basically the conf that I'm going to be using, right? So the command, in order to use a proxy config file, you will have to write down a command. So let me just put this right here. So it's going to be ngserve space --proxy -config dot proxy config, and then I will have to basically define the file in which I have defined the proxy. Right, so, and let me also close this down. I'm going to be running this once again. So npm run start. It looks like the port hasn't been cleared properly. So it'll take a moment and then clear out the port. All right, so now I have killed the port and I'm going to be starting the application once again. So I just need to put the plus up arrow and do an enter. All right, so application is again running at 4200. But then if you notice here at db.json, you would realize that I have really basically given the path as students record. So I don't really have the API path starting with /API. So these things are basically done in JSON server using a file called using a file called routes.json, and that routes.json must be defined in JSON server path when we start it. So I'll have to basically define the routes.json in order to define the complete route, which is basically starting the /API /students record, right? So this is what I essentially want. So let me close the server JSON server first of all, and also going to be cleaning. I'm also going to be killing the port 3000. Right, so I'm going to be creating another file which is called routes.json, and inside the routes.json I'm basically going to be putting in this. So what it essentially means is that whenever a request is intercepted, whenever a JSON server would intercept a request which is basically /API students record, it's going to be redirecting it to students record. The student record is the one which we have defined in jb.json. So the reason why we define routes.json or in JSON server is basically if you really want to define a complex condition such that let's say if you wish to render a particular route for a particular record, all of those things can be done using the routes.json, and the documentation of JSON server describes about all of these different use cases. In our case, since we only want students records to be rendered the moment you encounter, the moment the system particularly encounters /API students records in the URL at port 3000. So we want it to be redirected to students records. So I'm just going to be focusing on here. But in case if you want to know more about JSON server and its usage, please do write down in the comment section below, and I'll try to create a separate video tutorial around it, and which will talk in detail of what db.json is all about and things like that, right? So I'm just going to be closing this right here, closing this here as well. So the command which is basically used to run the JSON server using the routes is as follows. So I'm going to be writing JSON server db.json, and then I'm going to be defining a routes. Right, so now if you notice here, previously it only had shown us two routes, which is login and students record, and now in other routes if you look at here, it says /API /students record is going to be redirecting it to students record. So let's just test this out. So let me take you back to the browser, and here at the browser I'm going to be showing you what it essentially does. So let me just write it down this way: localhost 3000. So the moment you write down localhost 3000, it tells me what are the other available routes available. So students route, you can see that it renders this way. So let me now write down API /API /students routes. So there you go. So here also you can see that it renders the same. It basically redirects to students route, and the same records are being displayed over here. Right, so this is good. So we can now close this down and this as well. Now here right, so now I'll take you back to the page. They take you back to the diagram that we had been discussing all that while. Let me clear the board once again. Right, so what we have essentially done is that now defined the database using db.json. And here are the db.json. We have requested it using service, and the service receives the data stored here db.json using the external API that we have tried to mimic using json-server.db.json, and also given the routes there. So now effects would essentially have the data that we have stored in the db.json, and that's what we're going to be testing now. So let me take you back to the code editor. So here at the code editor, I think we're pretty much good, and we will have to go back to the service that we had initially written, which is over here. And here the service, now we are going to be writing the URL through which we are going to be receiving the data, right? So localhost 3000 students, basically it's going to be API / students records, and I think it is defined students record. Let me copy this up here and student records, right? And I think we are pretty much done with the service as well. And now I'm going to be basically importing all of these effects and Now I'm basically going to be telling you how this effects has to be actually included in the service, or in how these effects and other files that I've written has to be included in the application. Closed all the open files. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be showing you how these effects has to be imported in the application, right? So for that, I'll quickly take you to the browser, and here at the browser I'm going to be opening the documentation of NgRx, and here in the NgRx, please note that the application that we're building is a standalone application. It's not really a module based application, which is the older way of writing Angular application, right? So the module based application used to have a different approach in order to take the effects and stored inside the application. However, in the standalone application, it is a slightly different way to use it. Standalone application are basically we're going to be using the methods to import the effects, reducer, and other state related stuff, right? So okay, let me take you to the VS Code, and here at the VS Code, now we have written a service. We've also written action and effects. I'm going to be basically importing these action and effects inside the application module. So now you know that we already since you already know that we are not really building a module based application, rather we are building a component and a standalone component based application. In case of using standalone components based application, all these module dependencies are to be installed or imported inside the application using the methods. These methods are already provided by the libraries. So in order for our effect to take control of the API calls, we'll have to import that in the app.config.ts, right? So let me just open the app.config.ts, and here at the app.config.ts, firstly I'm going to be importing the method which is basically required for this effect to take control, right? So let me do the provide effects. So provide effects, and then I'll have to basically import the effect. Now let me put this effect inside the provide effect method here at the line number 17. Let me save the application, and let me also correct the imports in the order in which we usually define in my applications. So let me also put this here, save this. Yep, and we are good. And now let me take you back to the service using which we are going to be making an HTTP call in order to receive the data stored in the server. And we know that we are going to be basically using JSON server. So here as you can see that we're making use of another dependency which is called HTTP client. And HTTP client only works only if you have the HTTP module installed in your system. So since it's a standalone application, we are going to be basically providing the HTTP module based dependency using a method called provide HTTP client, right? So once you import this and put a comma here, now your application will also have the HTTP client module, and this module will be used basically to call this particular application. So now I think that we are done here, and now I'm going to be taking you to the web browser, and there we will try to see if the application works correctly or not. All right, so let me open the application here, close everything down, refresh this, and okay. Let me take you back to the code editor. There's one thing that we have missed, and that is basically to change the student's table component. So student table component, it will be basically used to initiate the first action, the first step of the diagram that we had discussed previously in the same episode, right? So we already have the dependency here. So we're going to be making use of this particular store to dispatch an action, and this action is something which we have already defined inside the state folder, and this state folder records action.ts file. So let me import this particular file here. state / records action, and I'm going to be making use of this particular dependency actions dot call student record API, and then I'm also going to be putting the parenthesis at the end. So yeah, I think we are pretty much done with the first step. All right, so now let me take you back to the web browser and refresh this particular page. And if you go towards the end, or rather here is the API call. Now you can see that we are making an API call using an action, and that particular action is basically bringing the result, which is basically being served at localhost 3000 port at the /API and /students records endpoint. And this particular record has 13, this particular endpoint has 13 records, as you can see, which is listed here in the preview section. Now we're going to be storing these 13s, these 13 records in the state, and that's something which are going to be moving to step number 5 and 6, which is basically calling another action to store this, and that particular action will be then intercepted by the reducer, and then reducer would eventually make a change in the state, right? So how, let me write down that logic as well. So in order to write down that logic, let me take you back to the code editor, and let me close this here, save this. Okay, I have just opened the student reducer.ts. In the student reducer.ts, if you look at line number 5, as you can see that the init state essentially holds a single record. That particular single record is stored as student's record inside the state of your application. But there is a slight change. So the application that we are building is going to be hosting a few other feature module as well. So we can't really store the student's record right at the root level. It's rather going to be having a feature slice with the name called students records, and that student record is going to be holding the list of array that we have defined like this, right? So let me make this particular change here, here the line number 5. So students records, put a colon here, and I'm going to be making this thing here. Let me cut this. State, and then I'm going to be putting it like this. Right, let me remove this additional semicolon from line number 21, and we are now good. Right, so now I'm going to be making another change, which is the step number 6, the last step precisely. That step involved intercepting the last action that we are going to be triggering from the effects, and that intercepted action is going to be holding the list of records which we would eventually store in the state, right? So how do we do that? We'll have to come at line number 24, and here let me write down the logic to intercept that particular event. Okay, so in order for you to write down such code, you will have to make use of a function called on, and this on function basically holds the logic to intercept the actions. So let me also import the actions from the file that we have used earlier. Import star as actions from students records action, and that particular action will basically hold the action name along with the action function. So actions dot call student report API success, and once you receive it, the second argument to this on function is the state and the payload that you're going to be receiving from that particular action, which is basically initiated by the effects file. So that logic has to go here. So the first is the state which was already there in practice in your application before initiating this action, which is basically being given here with a name called state. And the second argument is the payload, that's something which we are receiving from the effects, right? So all, I'll have to put this here. Let me also define these. Let me also import the on function from the store. So, all right, so I think we're good up till here. Let me take you back to the browser, and here the browser will refresh this application and see if the state is being populated properly or not. Looks like some of the errors are here, and we'll have to fix these as well. Let me read the error first. All right, looks like some error. Let me read it from the top to bottom, and let me analyze what's wrong with this. Okay, it looks like something wrong with the data source observable. Click on it. Oh, I think I know this. Fine, so let me take you back to code editor, and here at the code editor. So the problem here is that now, since we have changed the way in which our state looks, right? So response essentially is going to be having another sub property which is called students records, and that's where we are going to be having we're going to be having the records which are required to be shown. So let me write it this way. Press enter, save, and I'll take you back to the browser, and there you go. So now you can see that we have basically finished writing code required for our action to take into effect. So let me take you to the Redux, and here in the Redux you can see that the action which is initiated right after init is student table component called students records API, and after the API call was successful, the next action was triggered wherein it updated the students record. Okay, I think it is coming as nested, so let me fix this up and go back to code editor. Okay, so now we had seen that the students records objects are nested, which is essentially not needed. So we will have to make some changes in the way in which we store our state. So let me just open the config file first, the app config ts, and here we are basically storing the root state as students records, and I believe that we really need to make it just the students. So let me save this bit. And once this is done, we will also have to change the state, the way it looks, and I'll have to make it basically inside the selector. And here in the selector we can see that the app state again has the students record, and I believe we'll have to make it as students. And let's just save this, and also need to make the change here. And I think that's pretty much it. Let's go back to the browser and see, and there you go. You can see that the application has successfully loaded, and let me see how it looks now. So firstly we have students, and inside students we have students record, and yep, this looks good, I guess, right? So now we have the state properly defined, and let's also check in the network. Let's refresh this once again, and let's just select only the fetch XHR, and we can see that there are a number of records which are being returned, and all of those records are being shown here in the table, right? So we are pretty much good here. I believe That's all we wanted to explain in this tutorial. So let me go back to web browser once again and just refresh this page one more time. And let us just recap of what we have understood so far. All right, so here in this application, let me draw this rather. So we initiated our first action in the component, and this first action was basically intercepted by effects. So let me write down this one, and then this action was intercepted by effects. That's a step 2. And then after that, it made a call to the service, which is here. And this service, this was step number 3. And the data was received by effects. That's step number 4. And then this effects raised another action over here. This action was step number 5. And after this action was sent, it was further intercepted by the reducer. So this was step number 6, and which is then updated the store. Right. So I believe that we have now understood how the update of a store really works in case of an action. And we have seen how do we write an effect and the methods which are required for our standalone application to work properly when you write an effect and store related things. So I think we have covered basically everything which is required to be known in case of action effect service reducer. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in. It is an extreme pleasure to host these tutorial for you. And if you're liking my work, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Also hit the bell icon in case if I post a new video, you would be notified. So thanks again. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to see you in the next tutorial wherein we would talk about the again state management in a little more depth. So thank you once again, and I'll see you in the next one.